presentation on fiscal stability and fiscal responsibility. I would like to start right now, since we are running a little late. And I would like to start by saying that we're having this discussion at a very interesting time, a very crucial moment, because this is perhaps the first time in many years when developed countries are immersed in more fiscal difficulties than developing and emerging countries. And that's something that is very much in the air today. Fiscal crisis and fiscal adjustments, if we look at our past, have always generated some change in the way we think about fiscal policy, and I'm pretty sure that this time is not going to be different. If we think back to the time of the oil crisis in the mid-70s and early 80s, that gave rise to zero-based budgeting and to the first generation of commodity stabilization funds. Then, in the late 90s, the Asian crisis motivated drawing fiscal transparency codes, and then a little bit later, working on fiscal responsibility laws, further fueled by the Russian Argentine crisis of the early 2000s. So every time like this generates some change, and I think that we today have a very good opportunity of trying to figure out how this is going to what is going right now in different parts of the world, and how we believe that this is going to evolve in the near future. Very close to this place, we can see today that, for instance, the EU is discussing this new fiscal compound that involves a number of fiscal rules and institution building that will be very important in the years to come. But perhaps if we take a look at the way these institutions have evolved over time, we can see that perhaps we have been moving upstream in terms of fiscal management. Some 20 years ago, it was basically believed that there was one thing called a good fiscal policy, and if you delivered on that, that was enough. But later, we started analyzing what were the institutions that might generate a responsible fiscal policy. And then we realized that more was needed on transparency. So it was not just delivering something, but doing it in a certain way. And today, when we speak about fiscal rules and fiscal institutions and fiscal councils, we're thinking more about how to make commitments that are credible over time. So it looks like we are moving a little upstream, and perhaps also extend the time frame over which we analyze and formulate fiscal policy, and extending the subjects, areas, and institutions that we cover. So today we could say that fiscal policy is much broader than budgets. And if we look at the experience of developed countries in the last few years, we can see that many things have come out of the evolution of debt that does not have a one-to-one relationship with fiscal balances. This takes us to a number of issues that have to do with how permanent legislation and entitlements generate fiscal commitments, asset and liability management, and once we do this, we can identify a number of examples of opportunities for mutual learning, and perhaps this is a session where that perspective is especially useful. What emerging countries can learn from developed countries, and what developed countries can learn from emerging countries as well. On issues like how did the emerging countries overcome debt crisis in the past, on the issue of implementing or putting together fiscal rules and fiscal councils, how to deal with contingent liabilities, how to manage shocks, either from the economic side or from natural disasters, or how to build fiscal discipline at the subnational level. So we have a panel of very distinguished guests that will guide us through this discussion. And I'm very happy that we managed to have them, all of them, on board this afternoon. So just to go very rapidly over their backgrounds, and from going in this direction, we have Dr. Thanapat Reungsri from Thailand that has 11 years of experience working with the Bureau of Budget and the Thai Prime Minister's Office. He has primarily worked on the economic impact of budgetary policy, and his academic background is with a PhD economics at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia, working on the impact of public infrastructure investment on Thai economic growth. Then we have Mr. Ivar Sikk from Estonia. He's the Deputy Secretary General of the Ministry of Finance, and he has a very rich experience in Estonian politics, occupying key positions in national political fields. He's, as I said, he's currently Deputy Secretary General of the State Budget and the Governance Policy. Prior to that, he was a program manager at the Ministry of Agriculture, and then he moved to the Ministry of Finance as a head of department. He studied at the Estonian Academy of Agriculture and the Tartu Economic Executive Management School and the Institute of Law at the University of Tartu. And then further to my left, we have Mr. Sebastian Barnes. He's a senior economist at the OECD Economics Department. He's currently the head of the EU desk, and prior to that, he was head of the Ireland desk at the OECD, where he co-authored 2 economic surveys of Ireland, with a focus on macroeconomic and structural issues. Prior to joining the OECD, he was at the Bank of England, and he has a bachelor's degree at the University of Oxford, and then a master's degree in European political economy from the College of Europe at Bruges, and MC economics from LSE in the UK. And finally, we have Mr. Vicente Fretes Civils. He's the chief of the Fiscal and Municipal Management Division at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. He's from Argentina, and he has spent a very long career working in international organizations, 20 years with the World Bank, and then he moved to the IDB a few years ago, where I had the privilege to work with him. So it's very nice to have him here today to share the experience on fiscal management at the national and subnational level in Latin America and the Caribbean. So having made this brief introduction, I would like to offer the floor for each one of our panelists with some 8 minutes each for an initial presentation, and then leaving room for a rich discussion later. So Thanapat, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here, sitting among our very rich profile, distinguished participants. And thank you, the OECD, for giving me this opportunity to share the Thai experience on the fiscal consolidation. Talking about this session is very challenging on many aspects. One is that the topic of the session itself. The second is that since it's the last session of the day, so all of you will be very tired already, and try to capture your attention not to fall asleep. That's very challenging. And the last one would be my own time jet lag, because it would be almost midnight in Thailand by now. So that's another challenge for me. Okay, better get started since I have only 8 minutes. Before we go to the Thailand fiscal consolidation, first of all, I would like to give you a broad picture of why Thailand needs to have fiscal consolidation, whether we have been in a great debt already. The picture that I want to give you is that since 1997, as Mr. Mario mentioned earlier, the financial crisis in Asia started in Thailand. Okay, and from there, from the crisis, it resulted in the fiscal deficit for 6 consecutive years, from 1999 to 2004. Okay. The total amount of the deficit is $24 billion US. Okay. And then our economy gradually recover and be able to maintain budget, balanced budget during the fiscal year 2005 and 2006. But after that, we back to fiscal deficit again in 2007, 2008. That's because of we have a coup d'etat in that time. And moreover, in late 2008, we hit with the global crisis, which starts from the US. The result of the crisis lead us to the need of the fiscal economic stimulus package, okay, and it led to a large deficit in fiscal year 2009 of 14.7 billion US dollar 1 year alone, okay, and it's continued to 2010 of another 11.6 billion US dollar. Okay. So only these 2 years is more than what happened in late 1990s already. So the total debt that we have, the outstanding debt to GDP ratio in 2010 was 42% of the GDP. Okay. And actually, the crisis that we just have in 2009 actually is almost recovered by the late 2009. Okay. And we were talking about exit strategy by that time already. Then it's come the initiation of our fiscal consolidation, okay, because we were talking about exit strategy. The initiation of the fiscal, the deficit reduction in Thailand came from the OECD. Okay. From the presentation of Mr. Barry Anderson, the former head of the Budgeting and Public Expenditure Division during the 7th OECD Asia Senior Budget Official in Bangkok, early February 2010. Okay. In that presentation, Mr. Barry Anderson said about 19 of the lessons that many countries have learned from doing the deficit reduction. Okay. But I remember the last one, he said, yes, you can. And he explained a little bit further that it's not too early to plan for the future. Okay. And in fact, it is critical that countries get started now. Luckily, our budget director were in that meeting, and she took it seriously. So why wait until Thailand have another crisis? We better start now. So she she set up a task force to study on the deficit reduction in Thailand seriously. And I was the one of that task force. Okay. From our study, we found that in order to Thailand to achieve balanced budget within fiscal year 2017 or something, we need to get two things done. First is to increase the government income, the net government income, to have a growth rate of 10% annually. Okay, that's the one thing. The other thing is to cap the growth rate of budget expenditure to grow no more than 5% annually. Okay, but in fact, at that time, it was the other way around. The fact was that the average government income growth is 9.8%. But the budget expenditure, the income growth was 5.8%, but the expenditure growth was 9.5%. Okay, so it's the other way around. So from this result, that means we have a lot of work to be done. Okay, on both revenue side and the expenditure side. Okay, and for your information, in Thailand, we separate the two. Okay, the revenue side is under the Ministry of Finance, and the expenditure side is under the Prime Minister's office. So in order to work both things at the same time, we need kind of mutual cooperation between the two agencies. So we come up with the memorandum of understanding between the two agencies, okay, the Ministry of Finance and the Bureau of the Budget, which under the Prime Minister's office. The memorandum of understanding, I call it the MOU. This MOU has an aim to achieve the balanced budget within 5 fiscal years from the date that they signed, okay, which is in late 2009. The MOU consists of 9 broad guidelines, okay, which can be summarized into 2 main cores. One is to increase the revenue. The other is to reduce the expenditure. Sounds easy, but hard to be done. So let's talk about the first core function is to increase the revenue. To increase the revenue, since we heard from many speakers speaking about tax base is narrow in some countries, Thailand is one of them. It's one of the narrow tax-based country. The government income is only about 16% of the GDP of the whole country. Okay, that's the government income. Out of 100%, 90% of the government income is from tax. Okay, so non-tax income is only 10%. Out of that tax income, 55% is indirect tax, from the VAT, sales tax, excise tax, or whatever. And the other part, 45%, is from the direct tax. Okay. Direct tax is mainly from personal income tax and corporate income tax. To express more about this, the direct tax have a very low percentage to GDP. Okay, compare it for Thailand is only like 4.3 of the GDP only, while in industrialized countries it's like 20% of GDP. Okay. Why is that? You know, out of 64 million people in Thailand, 34 are labor force. Within that 34 labor force, only 34 million, only 10 million register to pay tax. Out of that 10 million who register to pay tax, they actually pay tax only 2.3 million. The rest was exempted because of their low income. So that shows how narrow it is. And for the corporate income tax, out of 500,000 companies, only 1,500 5,000 companies pay corporate income tax. Okay. To be more shocked, only 5,400 companies pay 90% of the corporate income tax. Okay. So that's the reason why we need to expand our tax base and also increase the efficiency and effectiveness of our tax collection process by they plan to use the technology and to reduce the tax avoidance, try to get them register as many as possible, and try to expanding the tax base by introducing new tax such as inheritance tax, which have never been implemented in Thailand before, and increased sin tax, like tax on alcohol, tobacco, those kind of things. And that's on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, let me give you a few background about our expenditure system. The Thailand used strategic performance-based budgeting, okay, which means that we link our budget expenditure to the government strategy or government policy. Okay. By doing that, we are able to come up with the tools called triple R's, which introduced by our current budget director. Triple R stand for review, redeploy, and replace. Okay, so in Thai context, for the review, before the line agency submit their budget request, we allow the agency to review their own budget first by comparing with the previous year performance and budget that they need, and let them cut their own budget. Okay. Let's say like they got a project, they ask 100% of the budget, but they use only 80%. So this year we allow them to cut their own budget to 80% of the previous year first, and then when they did that, they submit the request. It will become the second R, redeploy, implemented in the Bureau of the Budget. In the Bureau of the Budget, we will consider their request, which activities which considered non-urgent, okay, or low priorities, we will put it, take it back, okay, and such as like low priority investment or training and overseas visit, okay, we will cut that off. The third replace is from whatever we have been able to reduce. If they want to introduce a new project which align with the government strategy or government policy, they will be able to do that. Okay. Okay. Let me conclude. From doing this MOU and try to increase the revenue and reduce our budget expenditure, you may want to know how we do with the deficit reduction. The result was, frankly said, that unsuccessful. Why? Because unfortunately, Thailand was hit with the devastating flood in both year 2010 and 2011. Okay, so the government still needs a lot of budget to revitalize the situation and leads that to a deficit of about 4% of GDP in both year 2010 and 2011. But if we look at the revenue, only the revenue that we have made is increase of 16% from year 2010. Okay. In 2011, we have a growth of government income of 16.4%. Yep. that would be my conclusion. Thank you.
Mr. Reungsri, I think in the short time we gave you, you raised a number of issues of what it takes to do fiscal consolidation and impose fiscal discipline in emerging countries, and some of the surprises that sometimes struck, like in this case, the floods. Let me now offer the floor to Mr. Ivar Sikk. I think it would be very interesting to hear from him the experience of Estonia in implementing a fiscal consolidation plan that, in the case of Estonia, was very strong, and it was very key at the beginning of in the first years of the crisis. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. It's a great honor to be here and to contribute with all of you to the strategy on development. And I would like to thank about the opportunity to share Estonian experiences and lessons learned. And this is really a little bit different comparing my colleague just now described what happened in Thailand. Fiscal prudence is one of the key factors of defining the peace and quality of sustainable development. This is illustrated by the Eurozone debt crisis, which hinders economic development of the whole Europe. Estonia has a well-rooted culture of fiscal responsibility. At least we think so. We had currency board with fixed exchange rate from 1992 until 2011, when we joined with Eurozone. And our history with the same limit, more or less, 20 years. We have independence. Sound financial management since transition in early 90s. This is preference of conservative fiscal policy in Estonia. And the main kind of rule we run was midterm budgetary objective, balance or surplus. And this is well rooted, not officially, but informally for a long time. And now, like was mentioned by chairman, that now we have as well experiences and extensive experiences with consolidation in 2008 to 2010, in total 17% of the GDP. Many factors supported successful consolidation in Estonia. Like being a small country, it's helped to react quickly to the changing economic environment. But consolidation need was strongly internally driven. We had very strong political commitment. It means that balanced budget rule was fixed in the coalition agreement for a decade. And as well, leading party in the government had quite a long history to lead the country. Secondly, Eurozone entry, it was a very strong driver for us. And this was a specific goal to keep the framework, what is done by the Maastricht rules. And thirdly, I can say that we had very strong political support for consolidation. The consolidation need was well taken on board by the society. There was no protests and meetings in streets. And also most segments and sectors were addressed by the consolidation. That kind of forceful signal to the public was when we had remarkable cut back in wages in public sector, around 20%. And the public sector took that kind of driver role in the adjustment process. And really, that kind of stability orientation, people trust prudent fiscal management and long-rooted tax policy choices, what was done by the governments. And it succeeded as well for the government that in spring of 2011 we had election and the full government was re-elected again. And fourthly, what I want to say is that we have still very low debt as well after the recession period. That about 11% of the GDP we had buffers collected in the past because of the midterm budgetary objective balance or in surplus. Estonian experience has demonstrated that consolidation pays off even in the relative short term, at least in small, open, and flexible economy. Economic growth restored in 2010. Estonia is very much dependent on the conditions of the world and European economy, so the fiscal stance has to be highly adaptive. When the world trade collapsed in late 2008, Estonia's export declined by nearly 50% during the first half of 2009, and financial flows in banking sector almost stopped. Having faced simultaneous domestic shock and even more importantly the global trade and financial shock, government took rather consistent line at the very outset of the crisis. As well, we are so dependent on the world economy, we have to keep everything strictly in order domestically to be ready to face rapid external changes. Immediate measures were taken to maintain the credibility of state finances and keep fiscal position within, like I mentioned, Maastricht limits. From the beginning, the authorities were confident that any near-term negative impact would be offset by improved medium and long-term prospects. And this has been proved. The economy emerged from the crisis with substantial stronger fiscal position, otherwise in the case would be. What kind of consolidation measures Estonia used? Like I mentioned, that almost all sectors were covered. At the same time, it was taken into account that most vulnerable groups would be excluded from the cuts. Expenditure and revenue side measures were balanced. But important remark to be done that the expenditure ceiling was not very much fall. Because of the effective use of EU funds, we initiated different investment programs. What was initially planned in 2013, 2014, that we very much initiated quite a big that kind of investment programs financed by the EU funds. And the second, Estonia succeeded in negotiations agreement on the emission quota regime under the Kyoto Protocol. And quite a lot very important investments and revenues was taken from the quotas. Some examples of revenues expenditures in consolidation. Like I mentioned, that we started with cutting down the public sector operational cost around 20% compared to the crisis level. As well, we lowered the increase of pensions from 2009, 5% increase in 2009 instead of 14, what was forced by the law. And as well, 2010 and 11 pensions were not increased. As well, we reformed of the compensation scheme for the sick days and reduction of health insurance cost by 8%. And as well, suspending government co-payments to the second pillar pension funds for 2009 and 2010. But now it's already government continuing to pay to the second pillar. And we limited the borrowing limits for the local authorities and as well for the other public foundations. From the revenue side, it's quite normal that we increased VAT from 18 to 20%, and as well rise of alcohol, fuel, and tobacco excise tax, and as well unemployment insurance tax was increased. But we very much as well sailed of land and other property, state property was what was not very much needed for the public sector, but what was related with different operational costs, and this was benefit for the revenue side as well benefit for the expenditure side. What was we had less need to pay for different properties. And I can say that consolidation had many positive effects, at least from the Minister of Finance point of view, that we much more increased control over the general government players, as well better capacity to assess general government budget position, and all that kind of monitoring system was built up, what gave better position for planning and all other things for focusing next period budget expenditures and so on. And now I can say that we continuing that kind of strict fiscal goals. Just now already the second year we had structural surplus, and nominal surplus will be from the 2013. As well, debt burden will not increase. It is just now less than 10% in Estonia, and as it is planned that from 2015 we are ready again to increase reserves. And what is important, policy conclusion, I want to say that this is a simple fact that policy consolidation pays off even in relatively short term, at least in small, open and flexible economy. And as well, secondly, the buffers are needed for the future. That gave breathing space when the was most needed, and the market conditions for lending were in the very limited. And I think that this is conclusion from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sikk. Perhaps we have an interesting contrast between Thailand and Estonia, in the sense that seeing a fiscal consolidation program that was planned ahead over a 5-year time horizon, while in the case of Estonia it was pretty fast, and it reminds us that fiscal consolidation may be fast in Europe, may be substantial, and the government may even get re-elected. So that's an interesting feature. So now let me offer the floor to Sebastian Barnes. He's going to speak about the fiscal councils, an evolving institution. Let me just mention that last week we had the meeting of our network of parliamentary budget officials and budget and fiscal councils here at the OECD, with very interesting discussions. So the floor is yours, Sebastian, to share some of the experience.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this gathering. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to share with you two perspectives that I have, partly as an economist at the OECD working on the euro area, and partly as a member of the new Fiscal Council in Ireland. We've only been going for 6 months, and my ability to tell you draw a huge number of experiences. It's somewhat limited, but it has been a learning experience, and the learning curve has been very steep, so hopefully I can share with you a few ideas from there. I also found the presentation from our Estonian colleague very interesting. In some ways, Ireland is a country similar to Estonia, and I think a factor that he drew attention to, which I think is true in Ireland as well, is in terms of having a culture of people understanding this stuff, realizing that fiscal sustainability is important. Even if the outcomes haven't always been great, there is a kind of cultural commitment to doing these things properly and to paying your bills. As background, my take on fiscal policy is that it's been a disaster in developed countries over the last 20, 30, 40 years. It's really one of the areas where public policy has failed most significantly. And to back up my point, I have a few statistics that I was just looking at yesterday. If you take the debt to GDP ratio of the OECD area as a whole, at the time of the first oil crisis in 1973, it was under 40%. By 1987, they reached 60%. By 1998, it was almost 75%, and today it's close to 110% of GDP. So that's a phenomenal change, very consistent change. Basically, you have these big periods where it rises, it stabilizes a bit, and another shock comes along, and up it goes again. So that's a really terrible performance, and it involves pretty much all countries. There are to varying degrees, of course. There are a few exceptions. Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland would stand out within that story. But it's basically a very, very poor performance. A major complicating factor for developed countries, which would be different, I think, for developing countries, is a big problem has been low growth. And as we face our debt to GDP ratio of 110% in the OECD, one of the key challenges going forward is going to be to raise growth, because it's going to be extremely difficult to get debt down with the kind of growth rates that seem likely unless major reforms are undertaken. So I think that's a key complicating factor that has to be borne in mind. Another issue that's also extremely important is demographic aging. We talk a lot about kind of gross government debt numbers, but actually if you take the present value of unfunded pension liabilities in most OECD countries, it's easily several times bigger than the numbers that you see in debt. And these pressures, which at one time were a kind of thing for the future, are really coming quite close. The time when expenditure on health and pensions is going to increase is really now only a few years away in many, many countries. So I think it's a very challenging environment. To me, it reminds me a lot of monetary policy in the 1970s and 80s, which was a shambles. We had high inflation that was out of control. And eventually, we decided that independent central banks were an institutional way of going forward with this. And I think that's the point that we're getting towards with fiscal policy. The analogy obviously isn't exact, because fiscal policy involves all kinds of choices about distribution and things which don't really matter for monetary policy. But I think it is a useful way of thinking about this problem. And I think there are two things that independent central banks fix that need to be fixed in terms of fiscal policy. One is the political economy problem. The electoral cycle is quite short. People want to get re-elected. People are myopic, just at a general level without having bad incentives. And so this leads to a short-termism where it's always easier to spend a bit more now and then just kick the problem of repaying the debt further down the road. So one of them is a political problem. The second one, I think, is a technical problem, that I think the rigor and depth of economic thinking around fiscal policy is far less sophisticated today than around monetary policy. In Ireland, I know there are almost 70 economists working in the central bank, and I would say there are probably fewer than 10 people really who would be macroeconomists in the Department of Finance. It's just a huge difference, and I think that's pretty consistent across the board. If you look in Europe, there are hundreds of macroeconomists in the European Central Bank, but really very few in some of the institutions. So I think there's a requirement as well to increase the technical rigor of fiscal policy, to increase the transparency. Again, to give you an example, central banks are always talking about risks, and they have fan charts and all kinds of fancy ways of talking about risk. If you read most budget documents, it's pretty hard to find any discussion of risk. It's all about this is the number for next year. But of course, we know, as the Thai case shows, next year's number could be very, very different from the one that's forecast. So I think there are these two problems that need to be solved: a political problem, political economy problem, and a sort of technical problem. And that's led to this growing interest in fiscal institutions. In the US, we've had the Congressional Budget Office for a long time. In Europe, there's Stability and Growth Pact. The Swiss introduced a debt rule. And recently, there's been a lot of interest around fiscal councils. There's been one in Sweden for around a decade. The UK set up the Office for Budget Responsibility. And in Ireland, we had our fiscal council that was set up 6 months ago. So there's been a growing interest in these things to solve that problem. Looking around fiscal councils and fiscal institutions and rules more generally, there's a huge range of different practice, and I think that's for good reasons. But I'll just tell you what the Irish model is. In Ireland, we have a council of 5 people, of whom I'm one, and a small secretariat. And our mandate has 4 parts. The first part is looking at the government's macroeconomic forecasts to see if they're plausible, which I think is actually a relatively easy job. The second part is looking at the public finance forecasts, and I think that's a very, very important technical job, because reading budgetary documentation is incredibly difficult to do. It's very boring as well, in some perspective, and so there aren't many people around willing to do that. In fact, in public discussion, there's almost no one who can really get to the bottom of it. And so the Fiscal Council's job, and a huge part of the investment we've made so far, has been really to try and understand those numbers, how they're put together, how to interpret them. A good example is actually in terms of VAT. So in Ireland, they raised VAT in the past budget. And there was a huge public discussion, both amongst journalists and politicians, saying the government has completely misestimated the impact this will have on the economy. Okay, it's just complete idiots, the finance department. They've just not thought about this properly. We've now gone away and looked at it, and actually the method they used was pretty sensible. But that's a case where it took us several months really to go through that. And you don't get that from academics or journalists who are just trying to respond to a story quickly. And though the Department of Finance tried to explain it had got its numbers right, no one believed them because there's a political credibility problem. So there the Fiscal Council is really adding something, both in terms of technical skills and in terms of capacity and credibility. The final part of our or the final 2 parts of our mandate, one is to look at whether the fiscal policy is following the fiscal rules. And the final part is to make an assessment of the fiscal stance. And that's very important for the reason that I'm just going to come on to, which is there's a kind of trade-off in this game between rules and flexibility. In a way, rules allow you to commit yourself to pursuing particular policies, but at the same time, it's very hard to design rules that cover all of the different contingencies. And in Ireland, we've just produced a report because there's going to be a new framework law on budgetary rules. But we found it really extremely difficult to come up with a set of rules that gave you a good balance between demand management, sustainability, good management of the public finances, and that would work in all weathers. It was almost impossible to find a set of rules that did all of that. And in particular, to work in different phases. So the kind of rules that you have when debt's at 120% of GDP probably aren't the same that you would have at 60%. So it's almost impossible to cover all bases. So inevitably, there's an important element of judgment there, even if rules, I think, have their place. And basic rules are important, but there's an important element of judgment, and I think that's why the council is so important. And that's very important in the Irish case because you have a very small, open, volatile economy. And so it's very hard to use concepts like the structural budget balance, which if you have a stable economy is quite difficult to predict. But in an economy that can change so fast, you're always going to get it wrong, but you do need to have a good process to try and make a judgment about where you're heading. And that's where I think the Fiscal Council's assessment mandate is so important, because it says we first assess whether the government's meeting the rules, and then we make a kind of bottom line judgment. Is what you're doing making sense? And I think that's a very important part of it. We give the government a large margin of discretion, so our current policy advice is that the policy they have is within the appropriate range, which I think is fair enough, because these are judgment calls, and we don't have a special formula as economists that can tell you whether they're doing the right thing. But I think we are adding value in that we are saying this is a reasonable thing to do. We've thought about it, and this seems to be a reasonable policy. I want to finish with looking at 2 specific areas, sort of based on what I've learned in Ireland. One is that the problems in different countries are different. So in Ireland, public spending is always exactly what they said it would be in the budget. It's, to the nearest euro, they can always hit it spot on. There are countries in Europe which have real problems making sure that the amount of money spent is the amount of money that is agreed. So Ireland has no problem with that, and it's not a big focus for the Fiscal Council. Where Ireland does have a problem is in boom times, like the massive boom that we had in the 2000s. The political control is a bit weak, and it's very tempting for politicians in Ireland who are incredibly accountable to their voters to increase public spending. We've got the money, People want stuff, let's spend it. And so that's really where what the Fiscal Council has to come in and do, and to say in the good times, we need to save, which is, of course, always the problem with fiscal institutions. And I think it's a specific problem in a monetary union because the economy is going to be inherently volatile as a small economy where interest rates can be very destabilizing because the monetary policy is set for the whole European economy, not just for this small island of 4 million people. So that's the problem that I think in Ireland is extremely important for the Council. But in other countries, that may not be the problem. And so it's important to design institutions with that in mind. And my final point on what I've learned is in terms of designing the institutions, the way they fit into the political discourse. So in Ireland, we've developed good relations with the Parliament so far, but Ireland's a very executive-led system. So actually having just accountability to Parliament, just going to Parliament, wouldn't really work because people wouldn't care that much. But what they have in Ireland is a very vigorous media and a very vigorous culture of stability, I think. And so it's in that context that I think the design of the Fiscal Council, we're trying to make sure we use those as much as a disciplining device. And I have to say that every time I go to Ireland, I find the taxi drivers just unbelievably well informed about fiscal affairs because they've got this huge crisis going on. So in a way, it's a great time for the council to establish itself because people are interested in this stuff. In normal times, if you went into a pub, no one would care what the Fiscal Council said. But we now have this opportunity to put ourselves on the map. And I guess that's what we're trying to do. Thanks very much.
Sebastian, I think that at the end of your presentation, you raised a very important point, which is, how fiscal discipline can work during good times. And this, I think it's a good introduction to our last speaker, because, Latin America has been identified as a region that has been able to withstand the current crisis pretty well. And it would be, and part of that is usually attributed to prudent fiscal management prior to the crisis. So perhaps Vicente can share with us what really happened during those years, how much of that is really the basis for the ability of Latin America to keep growing. But the floor is yours to address that.
Thank you very much, Mario. Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting us to tell a little bit the story of Latin America. When I was listening to Sebastian, I thought he was talking about Latin America in the past. In fact, the taxi driver in Buenos Aires is very well informed about the economic situation, and it was in the past. But my presentation, we look at 3 or 4 things that I think that are useful, and in certain ways reverse this role that I have now to present. One is the fiscal policy that the Latin American economy have followed. Second, look at a little bit of the institution, particularly the fiscal rules. Third, look at the subnational, the fiscal federalism, and what happened in the subnational level. And lastly, I would like to share with you some key challenges and conclusions. On fiscal policy for Latin America and the Caribbean, the most important thing is that the initial conditions of public sector in terms of solvency, liquidity, and fiscal stance matters. And that's matter for stability and for sustainability. If I look at some key indicators of solvency, such as debt to GDP ratio and liquidity, such as net international reserve that have accumulated, we can see a completely different story from what we have heard before from Sebastian. Over the last 10 years, from 2000 to 2011, debt to GDP ratio in Latin America on average decreased from about 65% to around 47% before the crisis, and then increased a little bit to about 50% because of the counter-cyclical policies of the government. And secondly, international reserves increased 7 times over the last 10 years. So that's put the Latin American economy in a different ball game when the crisis started. And if you compare with European economies, particularly what I did, the difference is outstanding. And that has implication for the fiscal program, has implication for fiscal balances, and more importantly, has implication for economic growth. So what happened in Latin America and the Caribbean? I think that we have learned the lessons of the past. Fiscal consolidation during the 90s and the 2000s were substantial and pay off during the economic and financial crisis. First of all, the benign external environment and the booming commodity prices, both natural resource bases as well as agricultural products, helped significantly in attaining better fiscal position. But more importantly, the windfall from these booming prices were significantly saved. Obviously, there is a wide variety of countries and there is heterogeneity in terms of behavior. The South American countries particularly were in a better position to cope with the crisis, while the small countries such as Central America and Mexico, which were closely tied and closely related to the US economy, were significantly hit as a result of the economic and financial crisis. What were the key institutions that allow the consolidations of the 90s and 2000s? Most of the countries in Latin America have fiscal rules. Somehow they managed to establish fiscal rules and they have applied over the last 10 years. Most importantly, there are two other countries that also have structural balance rules, Chile and Colombia, that started to apply since last year. Most of the fiscal rules were procyclical, and that's why sometimes they have to modify or temporarily suspend it in order to avoid the procyclicality of the fiscal rules. So one important lesson from the crisis is that the fiscal rules need to be revised to be more effective for stabilization purposes, while reinforcing stability and transparency for the longer term. And why this was necessary? Because the automatic fiscal stabilizers are small in Latin America and the Caribbean. The two components, one is the tax structure, particularly income taxes, and within income taxes, personal income taxes is a very small share of the income structure of Latin American's economy. Second, there is a large informal labor market, and therefore the unemployment insurance doesn't work. Consequently, discretionary counter policies need to be complemented to fiscal rules, particularly if shocks were or are significant. Now, in order to have credible and effective fiscal rules, they need a commitment of fiscal authorities and need the political backup that was mentioned before in the previous presentations. In addition to those two elements, preconditions are necessary, such as macroeconomic coordination with monetary and exchange rate policy authorities, institutional capacity to make credible and realistic fiscal, economic, and financial projections, adequate coverage of public sector institutions and transactions, both above and below the financial balances, effective, transparent, relevant, and on-time public sector financial information and management system are also necessary, and a sound and a strong banking system, including supervision and regulation. Two important institutional devices could also strengthen fiscal rules. And as mentioned before, one is independent fiscal councils on congressional budget offices. Latin American and the Caribbean have some of those institutional devices, and a medium-term budgetary framework. That is at the national level. So what happened now at the subnational level? there are two there are two facts that are conditioning fiscal policy at a national level. One is that an increased share of expenditure realized at the subnational level. If you look at the last 20 years, there was an increase of about 100% of the expenditure responsibility compared to the previous 20 years on average in Latin America and the Caribbean. And decentralized countries such as Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil expend at the local level about 50% of the total expenditure of the country. And the second factor, that the decentralization or the fiscal decentralization was asymmetric in the sense that it was decentralized more on the expenditure side and less on the revenue side. The subnational governments depend heavily on direct transfer from the central government. One of the key elements to strengthen institutional capacity and also to ensure macro stability is that subnational governments and public financing as a national level are not included or incorporated explicitly in fiscal rule in the majority of the Latin American countries. This is changing, particularly in the bigger countries such as Brazil and Colombia. There are certain weaknesses that is required to overcome in order to have a consolidated fiscal framework included in rules at the national levels. One is information and management system. Second is there is a strong still resistance on the local level to establish some kind of rules of stabilization fund, for example. And there is weaknesses in the credibility of the centralized fiscal institution dealing with the national government. Obviously, as equally here in Europe, there are a wide variety and large sample of the national government. The central government has to deal with approximately 16,000 municipalities in the region, and this presents quite a challenge to establish certain rules. Let me conclude now with certain lessons and certain challenges. At the national level, as I mentioned before, initial conditions of policies are key to confront stability and to confront sustainability, particularly to confront external shocks and economic and financial crisis. Fiscal rules are very important element of fiscal consolidation processes. And cyclically adjusted fiscal rules are even more important to avoid pro-cyclical fiscal policy. But an adequate escape to escape clause, to include escape clause, could reinforce the flexibility, particularly for stability purposes. At the national level, as I mentioned, two facts are constraining the capacity at the national level. One is increasing expenditure responsibility, and second, low own resource collections and tax base. As a result of this, some national governments tend to be more pro-cyclical. So, in summary, the challenges for LAC on other regions as well as Europe, fiscal rules should be the result of a strong political commitment in order to be effective, credible, and sustainable. Fiscal policies need to be more symmetrical, particularly during commodity price boom, and they have to include a structural balance, a fiscal balance. Subnational governments should explicitly include it in the national fiscal rule, and this is particularly important because the own resource basis is very limited. Thank you very much.
Vicente, I think that with your presentation, we start doing a little bit of cross-fertilization through different regions and countries. And let me say that a few weeks ago I was in Madrid for a discussion on the organic law to implement the constitutional amendment there, where a very central element in the discussion was how to generate discipline with regional governments. And my comment to that was that in order to find an interesting model for that, possibly they should look at Brazil with their fiscal responsibility law from the late 1990s, early 2000s. It's a little more than 10 years old already. So with that, I would like to invite you to take the floor, and especially to focus on issues where we would have this mutual learning, and encourage also our speakers to in their responses to identify some lessons for other countries that may be at a different stage of development, but maybe sharing some common problems either from today or from a different time. So the floor is open for your comments and questions. So over here, please, the gentleman there.
Sorry. Huachen from Natural System Fund Manager is fund manager in Paris. Just a very short question on Thailand. You mentioned that over the last 2 years, the plan was unsuccessful mainly due to the flood. If we exclude this shock, external shock, what's the progress that you have made in Thailand, such as extending revenue and cut expenditure? Thank you.
Gentleman there, please.
Ce matin, nous avons écouté un problème sur la distribution, les indices Gini. Et ce soir, nous avons écouté une politique d'inflation compétitive. Chaque pays veut réduire les questions des dépenses sociales. Il y a une réduction pour les profits de les maladies. OK. Mais il y a un problème, qu'il n'y a pas bon consommateur. Alors, les meilleurs travailleurs pour faire un crescement de l'économie et une meilleure distribution de l'impôt. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Une autre intervention?
Oui, je prends la parole pour la deuxième fois parce que j'ai vu que le micro était libre. Sinon, j'allais passer ma parole à quelqu'un d'autre. Donc, ce matin, je suis intervenu par rapport au Rwanda parce que lors de l'exposé des deux panélistes, il s'est avéré que le Rwanda a connu un drame et c'est après le drame qu'il a eu un comportement exemplaire par rapport aux autres pays africains. Alors, je constate cet après-midi que ce sont les pays qui ont eu des problèmes qui apparemment s'en sortent. Est-ce que ça veut dire que les pays qui n'ont pas de précédents difficiles ne peuvent pas s'organiser à éviter les effets de la crise? Voilà ma question.
That's a very interesting point, and actually with less dramatic previous experiences, if you look at how developed countries have performed during this crisis, you can draw a very clear distinction between countries that had a crisis in the past and learn from those experiences, from those that had better times and found themselves more into trouble today. Another question, or then maybe I'll pass the floor to our speakers. I would just like to add one question for Sebastian, because as you know, today there is European countries are preparing this fiscal compact that involve not just one fiscal rule, but actually at least 3 of those, and then an institutional process to review budgets, to inform budgets, to assess compliance with commitments. And given that you're a member of the Irish Fiscal Council, perhaps it would be interesting to see how you see the role of fiscal councils within that more complex environment of a fiscal framework that is being set up for the whole, almost the whole membership of the European Union. So maybe we could proceed in the same order as before, starting with Mr. Reungsri.
Thank you. Okay. So the question about Thailand, if we excluding the impact of the flood, well, how well did we do with the fiscal consolidation? As I told you earlier, if excluding the flood expenditure, the revenue that we have made increased 16.4% from 2010 to 2011. The growth of government revenue increased by 16.4%. But for the expenditure side, if we cut off all the revitalized budget that we use for the flood, the deficit would reduce by half. Would be around roughly around 2% of the GDP. Yeah, because with the flood, including the impact of the flood, is 4% of the GDP. Yeah.
Can you once again thanks. What was the question? Because of the translation, I didn't read the question in France or French.
Yes. Well, we had 2 questions. One had to do with to what extent competitive deflation and trying to balance budgets as the economies are constraining makes sense as fiscal policy as compared to trying to restore growth and rebalance the budget on the basis of that growth. And the other question has to do with the way in which past crises of different nature, political or economic, actually shape the way in which countries prepare for a crisis in the future or behave more responsibly.
Okay, so on the European question that was raised, it's a very interesting question, actually. It's exactly the same question that Vincenzo was dealing with, in a sense, that the problem you get within countries between the sub-federal parts and the federation, in some sense, is what you have in Europe, in a slightly different way between the euro area, which has a common monetary policy, and between the countries that are essentially responsible for fiscal policy. So there you have many of the same tensions and the same problems that Vincenzo was talking about. One difference which is important is really in Europe the sovereigns keep a lot of the power, much more than the local governments, state governments would. And there's no particular problem of balanced assignments at that level because essentially all the powers are at national level or below. But we do have this construction and these kinds of problems. And so historically, and within the monetary union, there are really two challenges. One is for countries to set fiscal policy in a way that is sensible, sustainable for themselves, but also there's a potential spillover, which is what we've seen with this whole crisis over the past 2 years to other countries. And so other countries have an interest in making sure that all countries behave well. And obviously with the rescue funds and things, the possibility of moral hazard has increased a lot. And so that's why we have these institutions. We had the Stability and Growth Pact that came in as part of the process to monetary union, and it has basically been in place, been modified a little bit over time. And now we've just had a major reform of that. It's called the Six-Pack, to anyone who's a follower of these European things, like the beer. And that was basically an upgrade to the existing institutions, which is actually very significant, and is now EU law. So we went into law in December. And on top of that, the governments have tried to add some extra things like the Fiscal Compact. But essentially, in terms of economic substance, a lot of them come back to the rules that were already there. It's an attempt to sell the same product twice. There are some institutional differences, but in economic substance, it's the same. In terms of the position, I think that would be the OECD view of these things. And we've always taken the view that it is important in a monetary union to have some rules, just as within the federation it's important to have rules. However, it's very difficult to impose those rules when you have states that are sovereign and powerful, that issue their own debt and have their own tax-raising powers. And so there's only really so far you can get with the European rules. And it's also very important to avoid pro-cyclical policies at the state level, at the level of individual countries. And so we've always thought that national institutions are extremely important in that context. And while we hope the European reforms will work, there's no guarantee that they'll actually achieve anything more than what previously. And so we think that national institutions are really the safeguard. It's in countries' interest to do this. It's where most of the policy instruments and discussion takes place. And so it's extremely important that national institutions are upgraded. And part of what the European reforms are about is actually requiring countries to make improvements to their budgetary processes, to statistics, and things like that. One comment, and it's really a criticism I would make, is the complexity of the European rules is unbelievable. I would doubt more than about 3 people, and I'm not joking here, I really think only 3 people understand the way they work. I frequently interact with the European Commission at all sorts of levels, and I find a lot of people there don't understand how they work. And we found, and one danger I think, which the Commission does not realize, is that when you're trying to build up the national institutions, it's very difficult in a framework where you have such complex European laws. So in the Irish context, we were asked to give the government advice as the Fiscal Council on the new budgetary laws. But the European rules are already so complicated that it's really hard to find some space to say something new. And so I think that's a real difficulty, both in terms of the technical side, in terms of just the rules, European rules may be a bit too tight, not create enough space, but also in terms of the political discussion. There's just only so much attention anyone's ever going to want to give to fiscal rules. And if they have to spend all of it thinking about these really complicated rules from Europe, it kills a natural domestic debate. And as I said in my comments, I think different countries have different problems. And it's very hard to have a common approach for 27 countries that really deals with the specific situations of all countries. So as I said, we hope the upgrading of the European institutions works, and we hope that the national institutions are strengthened at the same time. But I think there is a risk that the over-heavy, in some ways, European architecture is going to weaken development of national institutions, which is probably the key thing.
There were 2 questions or comments regarding first the lessons learned from the past, and I think in the case of Latin America, it has happened. And particularly if you look at the big countries, Brazil is one example. Brazil, and recall a workshop at MIT, Professor Dombush used to say in the mid-90s, Brazil is still very drunk and is showing the drunkenness. Wait until Brazil could get sober and put in line a good macro framework and particular fiscal policy. And now we're seeing the results. And Mario brought up one of the important changes that took place as a consequence of the crisis of the mid-90s that was in certain way propelled as well as for the imbalances at the national level, the necessity of changing the rule of the game and establishing a fiscal responsibility law in 2000 that basically put order in the house domestically. That fiscal responsibility law was also further regulated in 2003 to establish specific rules on expenditure, on revenues, on debt at the national level. And that provided a framework, a friendly framework from the fiscal point of view for economic expansion. Simultaneously, they didn't forget about income redistribution, a question that was raised. And they acted and established particular programs through expenditure programs to tackle the income distribution issue. I think that in the previous session was mentioned Bolsa de Familia, which is a program that was successful in terms of handling specific problems of income distribution. Finally, with regard to the preconditions of the situation of Latin America and European, one important element to keep in mind is that most Latin American countries over the 10 years kept all the policy choices available to them. And that includes not only fiscal policy, but also monetary and exchange rate policy. That is completely different ballgame than the European, where the Europeans have decided to have a single currency, constraining the possibility of reacting to economic shocks, and without the institutions in place necessary to accommodate economic shocks. They, in fact, learning from the experience of confronting this crisis today.
Vicente, and thank you for that quotation from Rudy Dornbusch, because you know that one of the most important challenges in conducting a discussion on fiscal discipline is not to look like an AA meeting, but it's not easy. Perhaps to finish this discussion, perhaps we could also give Mr. Sikk an opportunity to elaborate on one point that he emphasized in his presentation, which is the effort in building consensus and using consultation in putting together a fiscal consolidation package. I think it would be interesting to learn what was the message that you put across to get different actors involved, and to what extent you were responsive to some of their concerns, and how that shaped the fiscal consolidation effort.
Thank you. I think that, like I mentioned, that in Estonia, we had quite that kind of consensus approach to the consolidation for the different players, but because of the quite small country, and we didn't add any that kind of dramatic recessions beforehand, then we tried from the Ministry of Finance side to push that kind of exercise firstly to the Parliament, that we have a difficult situation, and we can't to manage only with different few things to cut expenditures and so on. That really we need to change policies, and to change policies, this is related with different laws what are fixed, and we tried to push that kind of coordination role to the Parliament, but we unsucceeded because politicians they are not want very much to deal with that kind of bad things, and after I can say that few months discussions all that kind of coordination role was given back to the Minister of Finance. And we tried then to push in the cabinet to put in the cabinet level with a group of the politicians, small group, to make that kind of tough decisions. And then we can say that we succeeded. We prepared from the Ministry of Finance side different scenarios. We started to take to the board as well different academical people to make analysis and research what kind of influence for one or other policy changes. And after that, we made that kind of long list of different changes for the cabinet. And in cabinet level, they made that kind of tough decisions. And example, the first negative supplementary budget in beginning of 2008 and 2009, we changed around 30 different laws. And this is, was put to the parliament together with voting to the government that they are succeeding or not. And then we had quite a lot, during the time we had quite a lot different discussions in media and as well academical people was involved in the media and so on, who tried to describe what could happen if we will not make changes. Because we had, unfortunately, quite that kind of bad examples, example in southern part of neighbors. Example, Latvia, they very much, they didn't react it very fastly and happened very, very bad things. The debt, they didn't have any reserves. The debt level increased very rapidly, and they had very much problems because they didn't quickly started to change different policies and laws. What we did, that it, I think that this was that kind of the best experiences, and I think that we trying to make that kind of booklet for future how government could track them in political level as well in administration level. But because the recession was 2 years, then of course we can't make only that kind of very political decisions and to change policies. This was one part of the experiences. The other part was that if we already started to make fifth negative supplementary budget, then we took that kind of quite flat rate for everybody, that all ministries and public administration could cut, example, 5% to find themselves where they have that kind of additional possibilities to make expenditure cuts. That it is, we can say that this was not very much that kind of political decisions, but it was so-called administrative level decisions. What gave, I can say that in the final day, quite positive results for Estonia.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're reaching the end of this session. During the discussion, I think we have touched upon a number of factors that have to do with how fiscal discipline can actually be implemented, and at the same time responding to the needs of citizens and policy commitments. We have discussed the arithmetic of fiscal consolidation. We have discussed the timeliness, the political economy of it, the institutions that are required, and I think that from that we can draw a number of lessons that can be useful for different countries, respecting, of course, all the differences that we know. So with that, given that this is not a meeting of AA, we do not need to close this meeting with a hug, but with a big round of applause to our participants, please. And we'll see you tomorrow with the conclusion of this meeting. Thank you.